Hello, welcome to our Word on Fire Institute family, and for all of those joining us on YouTube Live, I'm Joshua Bidding, the Assistant Director at the Word on Fire Institute. Welcome to Evangelization and Culture Live, our monthly 3-day live seminar on a topic at the crossroads of faith and culture. We are delighted to have with us in the studio today Dr. Holly Ordway, a professor here at Word on Fire Institute, as well as an acclaimed author and lecturer. Dr. Ordway also leads our writing community for the Institute. She will give a 3-part lecture, The Christian Witness of J.R.R. Tolkien. Today's lecture is entitled, To What Extent is the Lord of the Rings a Christian Book? We are dual streaming today's presentation on the Institute platform as well as on YouTube. For those of you viewing the Institute platform, please open up the chat icon on your screen and introduce yourself, who you are, and where you're joining us from. As we begin, please start typing in your questions and comments, which we'll be getting to in the second half of today's presentation. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, please be encouraged to do the same. We want to invite everyone joining us on YouTube to consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. I'll say more about that at the end. But without further ado, let's get to Dr. Holly Ordway on the Christian Witness of J.R.R. Tolkien. Class is in session.
Well, welcome everyone to our seminar series. And so what I will be exploring today in our first session, as you can see from our title here on the slide, to what extent is The Lord of the Rings a Christian book? Now, this question might seem to be simple at first, but it turns out to be quite a complex subject. The Lord of the Rings is Tolkien's masterpiece, and I'm sure it's familiar to you either through the book or through Peter Jackson's film trilogy or both. So I've posed a question in the title of my talk: to what extent is The Lord of the Rings a Christian book? ? Now, we can certainly say it's a Christian book in the sense that Tolkien himself was a Christian. He was a devout Catholic. But what we're going to wrestle with today is the question of Tolkien's authorial intentions, with particular application to the difficult question of the religious elements in his writings. That is, to what extent is The Lord of the Rings a Christian book in the sense of Tolkien intending it to convey a Christian message? To that question, you might well respond by pointing out one of the most famous and frequently quoted lines from Tolkien's letters. After all, Tolkien himself says that The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Doesn't that answer the question? Won't this make for an awfully short lecture? Well, not so fast. As Treebeard might say, don't be hasty. And as Tolkien said, with regard to the study of fairy stories, this is a rash adventure. There are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And we may stumble into some serious interpretive pitfalls if we take a simplistic approach to the issue of authorial intention. So let's start by considering some background concepts. First, what is a fallacy? A fallacy is, as the Oxford English Dictionary puts it, a mistaken or delusory belief or an idea, an error, especially one founded on unsound reasoning. The specific term intentional fallacy was coined in 1946 by W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley, who present the fallacy as the view that in order to judge the poet's performance, we must know what he intended. The problem is not with considering authorial intention. Rather, the error is in thinking that we must know the author's intention in order to understand the text. We should avoid the intentional fallacy because it oversimplifies the situation. even if we have seemingly direct and unambiguous knowledge of the author's stated intentions, is not the only thing that matters. A different but related error is what Tolkien's great friend C.S. Lewis called the personal heresy. This is the error of assuming that when we read something that an author has written, we are making direct personal contact with the personality and the views of the author. But when we read a book, we are not encountering the author himself, but rather we're encountering a thing that the author has made. The personal heresy is an error because it confuses us about what a literary text can do. Can a text give us insight into the mind of the author? Yes, absolutely. What it cannot do is provide direct, unambiguous access to the personality or the views of the author. As Lewis puts it, of a book's meaning, the author is not necessarily the best and is never a perfect judge. One of his intentions usually was that it should have a certain meaning. He cannot be sure that it has. He cannot even be sure that the meaning he intended it to have was in every way, or even at all, better than the meaning which readers find in it. Here, therefore, the critic has great freedom to range without fear of contradiction from the author's superior knowledge. So, the intentional fallacy, the personal heresy. I've set out these two fallacies, these two errors, not to reject the value of considering authorial intention, but to help us avoid being, as Tolkien put it, rash and overbold. In short, so that we can be successful explorers and bring our adventure to a productive conclusion. If we're careful and judicious, considering the author's intentions can provide us with valuable insights, and it's particularly helpful as a way of recognizing and correcting any assumptions that we might bring to the text. One of the challenges in understanding Tolkien's authorial intentions is that he contradicted himself, or he appeared to do so. For the works that were published in his lifetime, we do at least have a text that represents his final decision, though even that could change. In the first edition of The Hobbit, Bilbo wins the riddle game and Gollum freely hands over the ring. But as Tolkien worked on the draft of The Lord of the Rings, he developed the ring into a much more sinister item with a corrupting effect on the user, something that he had not originally thought of when he wrote The Hobbit. So, in the 1951 edition of The Hobbit, he changed it so that Gollum no longer willingly gives up the ring, and there's this trickery involved. Now, in this instance, we know that Tolkien intended for the backstory of the ring to change because he saw those changes go into print under his supervision. However, I don't think that we can identify a clear authorial intent for the stories that he didn't finish, which were many, especially not the ones that he was still tinkering with at the time of his death. The many stories that make up Tolkien's legendarium as a whole were written and revised at different times over the course of his very long life, and sometimes they contradict one another. For instance, are the orcs totally evil, or could they repent? Was Galadriel rebellious, or not really? Did the world of Arda change from flat to round, or was it always round? These are questions that Tolkien had different views on at different times, and for which he came to no settled conclusion. Tolkien's mode of composition was to think on paper. Just because he wrote it down doesn't mean he had made a decision. The contradictions in the drafts are interesting in other ways. We can see the tension between different versions of an idea, and this shows us something about Tolkien's creative process and what he held to be important. And to me, that seems at least as interesting, if not more so, than determining a once and for all status for the orcs, for instance. So that was implicit contradiction. The other kind of apparent contradiction has to do with Tolkien's explicit statements of authorial intent. So let's turn now to considering The Lord of the Rings. What does Tolkien say is the meaning of this book? In his published letters and in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien made many statements on this subject. And you can find a selection of these statements on the handout that's been provided for this lecture. And you can consult that now or refer to it afterwards. For right now, buckle your seatbelts and let's see what Tolkien says about his book. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. As for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. The whole matter from beginning to end is mainly concerned with the relation of creation to making and subcreation. There is no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary, in the work at all. Of course, my story is not an allegory of atomic power, but of power exerted for domination. It is not about anything but itself. Certainly, it has no allegorical intentions, general, particular, or topical, moral, religious, or political. I have deliberately written a tale which is built on or out of certain religious ideas, but is not an allegory of them or anything else, and does not mention them overtly, still less preach them. It is mainly concerned with death and immortality. In The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is not basically about freedom, though that is naturally involved. It is about God and his sole right to divine honor. It is about death and the desire for deathlessness. As for message, I have none really, if by that is meant the conscious purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings of preaching or of delivering myself of a vision of truth specially revealed to me. I said, or meant to say, that the message was the hideous peril of confusing true immortality with limitless serial longevity, freedom from time and a clinging to time. In The Lord of the Rings, I neither preach nor teach. I would claim, if I did not think it presumptuous in one so ill-instructed, to have as one object the elucidation of truth and the encouragement of good morals in this real world. The invention of languages is the foundation. It is, to me anyway, largely an essay in linguistic aesthetic, as I sometimes say to people who ask me, what is it all about? Well, a little overwhelming, perhaps? I have deliberately selected this sample of quotations to highlight some very interesting points. We can see that Tolkien is perfectly willing to contradict himself, or at any rate to seem to do so. He firmly states it is not about anything but itself, but then he also says it is about death. He says that The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally Catholic, but also that the invention of languages is the foundation. He declares that as for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. And he also says that the message was the hideous peril of confusing true immortality with limitless serial longevity. What are we to make of all this? One approach to this variability would be to declare that Tolkien is not a reliable source and refuse to admit his own statements as evidence to guide our interpretation of his works. We can avoid cherry picking by declaring the cherry tree to be off limits. I don't think we need to do this, and I don't think we ought to do this. I think there are ways to approach his statements of authorial intent that will help us to navigate these apparent contradictions. But I will say that radical skepticism about the reliability of Tolkien's self-assessment is a more intellectually sound approach than simply picking and choosing the statement that fits one's particular argument and disregarding the statements that are contradictory. I propose then to explore 4 concepts that I believe will help us to navigate Tolkien's statements of authorial intent and come to a more nuanced understanding of The Lord of the Rings. The first of these is the distinction that Tolkien makes between conscious and unconscious intention. We see this, for instance, when he observed that E.A. Wicksmith's children's novel, The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, was probably an unconscious source book for the hobbits. He did not deliberately and consciously draw on Wicksmith's book to provide him with material for the hobbits, but rather recognized after the fact that having read this book and enjoyed it with his children, his imagination had assimilated it and used it. And we can see this if we look at the Snurgs and the hobbits. Even the illustrations of the Snurgs themselves in Wicksmith's book show us how similar the Snurgs are to the hobbits, but it's even more apparent in the text itself. This distinction between conscious and unconscious intention helps us to resolve some difficulties. Consider what Tolkien says about Tom Bombadil, that most mysterious character. Tolkien explains, I do not mean him to be an allegory, or I should not have given him so particular, individual, and ridiculous a name. But allegory is the only mode of exhibiting certain functions. He is then an allegory, or an exemplar, a particular embodying of pure, real, natural science. Remarkably, Tolkien seems to have versed himself in the space of a single sentence. First, I do not mean him to be an allegory, and then, he is then an allegory. But if we keep in mind the distinction between conscious and unconscious intent, this is not a contradiction at all. Tolkien didn't plan for Tom Bombadil to be an allegorical figure, a point which is supported by the fact that Tom was a pre-existing character in his poetry, predating The Lord of the Rings. Then later, Tolkien evidently became aware of what his creative imagination had done. Why is Tom in The Lord of the Rings? Tolkien says, in historical fact, I put him in because I had already invented him independently and wanted an adventure on the way. But I kept him in and as he was because he represents certain things otherwise left out. This interplay between the conscious and unconscious forms of intention helps us to better understand the way that Tolkien often begins by apparently denying intention, only to follow with a statement that provides an intention. As for message, I have none really, if by that is meant the conscious purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings, of preaching, or of delivering myself of a vision of truth specially revealed to me. I was primarily writing an exciting story in an atmosphere and background such as I find personally attractive. But in such a process, inevitably one's own taste, ideas, and beliefs get taken up. Though it is only in reading the work myself with criticisms in mind that I become aware of the dominance of the theme of death. I said or meant to say that the message was the hideous peril of confusing true immortality with limitless serial longevity, freedom from time, and the clinging to time. Here, Tolkien is first identifying his primary conscious authorial intent to write an exciting story. In that sense, he is perfectly correct to say, as he does elsewhere, that it is not about anything but itself, and that as for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. Then we get the characteristic Tolkienian pivot. Having cleared up any misapprehensions about deliberate didactic purposes, he says, but in such a process, inevitably, one's own taste, ideas, and beliefs get taken up. Inevitably, they get taken up. This is a process that happens without conscious, deliberate control. And then after the fact, he can recognize the themes, indeed the message, which his unconscious mind had infused into the work. And then he can state it, as he does in another letter, without the caveats. It is mainly concerned with death and immortality. If we want to understand the meaning or the message related to death and immortality in The Lord of the Rings, the entry point would be to determine Tolkien's taste, ideas, and beliefs on this subject. Why is it a hideous peril to confuse true immortality with limitless serial longevity? It might not seem so terrible to readers, and that makes it all the more important to find the context to illuminate Tolkien's view. It would be important to determine what Tolkien believed as a devout Catholic about death and immortality. It would also be relevant to consider his own encounters with death, both in his family and in the Great War, and also to look at literary representations of immortality, such as we have in H. Rider Haggard's She and King Solomon's Mines, both of which we know Tolkien to have read. His religious beliefs, his personal experiences, his reading habits all provide useful information. How we weight these, how we use that information, this is a more complex question, and perhaps we might come to that in the Q&A if that's of interest. The second concept that will help us is an awareness of Tolkien's habit of hyperbole. C.S. Lewis once remarked that Tolkien's lively mind sometimes leads him with perfectly innocent intentions to overstate things. Tolkien's son Christopher admitted that his father had a tendency toward the rhetorical superlative. His friend George Sayer recalled conversations over beer with Tolkien and the Lewis brothers, in which he recalled Tolkien one moment might be smiling and genial, but a few seconds later he might burst into savage, scathing criticism. Sayer felt that even when the topics are serious, there was always an element of acting about this gesturing. Knowing Tolkien's enjoyment of hyperbole reminds us not to attach undue importance to how vehemently he expressed himself in any given situation. But it's more than that. Sometimes Tolkien used hyperbole in what I can only describe as a strategic manner. A classic example of this is in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, in which he says, "I cordially dislike allegory in all of its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence." Not only does he dislike allegory, but he dislikes it in all of its manifestations and has always done so. Well then, settled, right? Don't be hasty, as Treebeard says. Trouble is, this is just not true, as many critics have noticed. Tolkien did use allegory when it suited him, most obviously in the opening of his essay Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, but also in other works, including by his own account in his beautiful story Leaf by Niggle and in parts of Smith of Wootton Major. What's going on here? In this foreword, he specifically declares that The Lord of the Rings is neither allegorical nor topical. But as we keep reading, it becomes apparent that he has a particular allegorical and topical reading in mind. He explains that a crucial chapter of The Lord of the Rings was written long before the foreshadow of 1939 had yet become a threat of inevitable disaster. Its sources are things long before in mind, or in some cases already written, and little or nothing in it was modified by the war that began in 1939 or its sequels. The real war does not resemble the legendary war in its process or its conclusion. His aim in context is to discourage readers from taking the War of the Ring as an allegory of the Second World War, as some were attempting to do. They were sending him letters asking, so is Sauron Hitler or is he Stalin? No. It's not an allegory of the Second World War. So he's using hyperbole to make sure that a specific misreading is definitively squashed. Or consider his firm statement, there is no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary in the work at all. He then goes on to say this, but of course, if one sets out to address adults, they will not be pleased, excited, or moved unless the whole or the instance seem to be about something worth considering. More e.g. than mere danger and escape, there must be some relevance to the human situation of all periods. So something of the teller's own reflections and values will inevitably get worked in. This is not the same as allegory. We all, in groups or as individuals, exemplify general principles, but we do not represent them. The term allegory is very problematic for Tolkien. Again and again, he backs away from it and then he approaches it. He rejects it in favor of the term applicability, and then he admits to its value after all. So when Tolkien denies that The Lord of the Rings is an allegory, he's not denying an underlying meaning, and he's not denying that he uses symbolism or even allegorical elements when it suits him. He is saying that the work as a whole is not in the literary category of allegory, which he, as a medievalist, understood very well, but one that readers who are not steeped in ancient and medieval forms of writing, that is, most of us, tend to misunderstand and oversimplify. It's much too large a topic to consider at this point, but again, we can refer back to it in the Q&A if people are interested. A third point to consider is Tolkien's Englishness and the effect that it has on his communication style. I've spent a lot of time in England, specifically Oxford, over the last decade and a half. And trust me, English people don't communicate exactly like Americans. I'm reminded of a time years ago when I made the rash move of assigning Tolkien's essay on fairy stories to an American undergraduate class. In the opening of that essay, as you know, Tolkien says that he proposes to speak about fairy stories, but he says, I have not studied them professionally. I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in the land, full of wonder, but not of information. Later in the essay, he clears his throat by saying, ridiculous though it may be for one so ill-instructed to have an opinion in this critical matter, before delivering a very precise rebuke. I venture to think that the verbal distinction philologically inappropriate and the analysis inaccurate. One of my students raised his hand and said, if he doesn't know anything about this stuff, why are you making us read his essay? And so I was faced with the challenge of attempting to explain to my students that actually this is a classic English move. It's a classic English rhetorical move of emphasizing his authority by downplaying it. I don't think they bought it, but it's true. The English avoid earnestness. It violates the unspoken norm of reserve and restraint. It implies a lack of emotional self-restraints, even gushiness. As Bertrand Russell remarked, the highest praise that many English people ever use is not bad. That's a true statement. So in downplaying his expertise, Tolkien is really saying what he would never say out loud. I am a world-class expert on this subject. Listen up. He would never say that. Now we catch a glimpse of this in Tolkien's interviews. In one of them, after the interviewer praises the poetry in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien admits that he prefers writing verse to almost anything else. Parenthetically, he adds, almost impossible to sell verse, though. He has a momentary burst of sincerity about how much he values writing poetry, but he doesn't want the sincerity to be mistaken for gushiness, so he immediately deflates it. Tolkien's self-deprecation is particularly important with regard to his statements of authorial intent, because he tends to downplay the things that matter to him most. With that in mind, we should perhaps pay closer attention to those remarks in which he does connect the Lord of the Rings to his faith, precisely because that's the sort of thing that his Englishness would typically tend to inhibit him from admitting. And now, suitably prepared, we can consider a fourth factor that affects Tolkien's statements of intention with regard specifically to religious themes or ideas. We won't say messages. He was forthright about his religious convictions, telling one interviewer, "I'm a Roman Catholic, devout Roman Catholic." He wrote in 1958 letter that, regarding the sources of the Lord of the Rings, "If I may say so with humility, the Christian religion, which I profess, is far the most powerful ultimate source. On a lower plane, my linguistic interest is the most powerful force." His faith was of profound importance to him. And when first The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings made him internationally famous, he now had a very large audience who were very interested in everything that he had to say. And I think that this put him in a bit of a bind. On the one hand, it gave him the opportunity to speak about his faith to a wider audience. And this would have raised at least a twinge of conscience, as he would see it as part of his responsibility as a professing Christian. On the other hand, he knew his limitations, and he knew that he had no calling to become an amateur theologian or a public apologist like his friend C.S. Lewis. Furthermore, his spiritual formation as a young man at the Birmingham Oratory of St. Philip Neri had placed a great emphasis on the value of humility. As a result, Tolkien was particularly sensitive to the spiritual dangers of letting himself be put on a pedestal. He was aware of this even with regard to merely literary praise from his admirers, which he called incense, as an incense offered to idols. If he were to become a public figure for his pronouncements on the spiritual life, many of his readers would have been all too ready to make him a guru. So I think that Tolkien's deliberate practice of humility helps to account for the way that he generally discusses in these elements of his work in any detail, only with those correspondents and friends who shared his basic premises, such as Clyde Kilby, who was an evangelical Protestant, or Robert Murray, a fellow Catholic. With them, he could acknowledge the spiritual elements in his work without worrying about being taken as a religious expert. Related to this is the fact that Tolkien had a certain love of hiddenness. Tolkien sometimes deliberately cloaked his intentions in order to convey elements of theological mystery of the sacred. And so this quality of humility, even hiddenness, helps to account for the way in which Tolkien sometimes downplays or even denies the religious themes and ideas in his imaginative writings. All four of these points, conscious versus unconscious intent, hyperbole, Englishness, and humility, add up to indicate that we should be extremely cautious about extracting single sentences from Tolkien's letters and making them carry the weight of an apparently simple and clear authorial intent. Tolkien, much more than other authors, including C.S. Lewis, needs to be considered in context, assessing his tone, his audience, and the way that he introduces and then develops his points in the surrounding material, and also the larger context of his other remarks on the same subject. This picture is even further complicated by the fact that Tolkien himself sometimes confessed ignorance about his work. For instance, when he was asked about the colors of the other wizards, he replied, "I have not named the colors because I do not know them." He also recognized the stylistic diversity of his own literary work, noting, for instance, that some features of the story are more mythical and others more historical. He remarked, "You cannot press the One Ring too hard, for it is, of course, a mythical feature, even though the world of the tales is conceived in more or less historical terms." Now, at last, let's turn to his famous statement about The Lord of the Rings being a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. It's useful first to observe that he's writing to Robert Murray, who is not only a Catholic, but a friend for whom he was somewhat of a mentor, as Tolkien had encouraged Murray in the process of becoming a Catholic. In this context, then, we can expect Tolkien to be a little less guarded than usual. Now we can look at the longer passage for essential context. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. However, that is very clumsily put and sounds more self-important than I feel. For as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little and should chiefly be grateful for having been brought up since I was 8 in a faith that has nourished me and taught me all the little that I know. This is a much more sophisticated self-analysis than it would seem from just the first line of it being quoted, as it so often is. Tolkien explains that his work was unconsciously religious and Catholic. That is, the underpinnings of the fundamentally religious and Catholic element were not deliberately introduced through conscious authorial intent, but emerged into the work unconsciously. Once he recognized those elements, then conscious authorial intent came into effect in shaping them for the revision. Recognizing this mix of conscious and unconscious authorial intents is helpful in avoiding both overstatement and false either-or situations. Is Aragorn a Christ figure in The Lord of the Rings? I think that this is an interpretation that can be supported by evidence in the published text. Did Tolkien have Aragorn in mind as a Christ figure from the beginning? Probably not, considering that in the first draft of the book, Aragorn appears as a hobbit named Trotter who wears wooden shoes. Regardless of which elements were unconsciously and which were consciously intended, Tolkien explains that the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. I think that this particular statement of authorial intent carries a lot of weight and can be taken at or near face value precisely because it's stated in very modest terms and is followed by his characteristic self-deprecation. However, that's very clumsily put and sounds more self-important than I feel. This is actually a signal that we can take this as face value. The more important something is to him, the more he tends to express himself in a modest and self-deprecating manner. He goes on to say, "For as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little." This statement is peculiarly revealing by its very understatement. Apart from recognizing the unconscious foundations of the religious element in his work, it also concedes a point. He consciously planned very little, but it means at least something was consciously planned. Returning to the first bit of the quote, the key word, it seems to me, is fundamentally at the foundation. We see this again in another statement along the same lines. He said, "I have deliberately written a tale which is built on or out of certain religious ideas." Now, there's much more that could be said, but in conclusion, let me offer just one thought about those religious ideas upon which he said he built his story. I would suggest that the basic way in which The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally religious is that it exists at all. Regarding the writing of fantasy, he says in his essay on fairy stories, "We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker." At the most fundamental level, The Lord of the Rings is religious in Tolkien's view because his own creative imagination, and therefore his ability to subcreate as a writer, derives from the divine creativity of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of whom God the Son is the Word made flesh. Having this truly foundational concept in mind is, I think, helpful because it allows us to recognize the extremely wide range of ideas and themes that Tolkien could explore in his imaginative works while being consistent with his devout Catholic faith. For instance, as he explains to a worried Catholic reader in letter 153, elvish reincarnation is not contrary to the Catholic faith. The Church's teachings on reincarnation apply only to humans, not elves. Similarly, in letter 212, he's perfectly straightforward in saying that the creation story in his legendarium has a very important difference from the Genesis account that he held to be true in the primary world. He explains that although in the Christian story, evil is introduced into the world after its creation, in his legendarium, he says, the rebellion of created free will precedes creation of the world, Ea, and Ea has in it subcreatively introduced evil rebellion's discordant elements of its own nature already when the let it be was spoken. His clear theological distinction between the subcreated world and the primary world meant that he could, with a clear conscience, explore what ifs and counterfactuals in his imagined world. So, did Tolkien intend to write a fundamentally religious and Catholic work? I would say no. He did not consciously and deliberately set out to make The Lord of the Rings into a religious and Catholic work. Rather, that aspect of the work arose osmotically from the whole cast of his mind and person. But also, yes, in that he recognized this aspect of his work while it was still in the draft and embraced it consciously as a legitimate part of his imaginative project. If we keep that tension in mind, as well as all the other factors that complicate the question of authorial intent, we will be reasonably well prepared to make more nuanced and thoughtful and well-informed interpretations of Tolkien's work. So let's give Tolkien the last word. And it is also said, answered Frodo, go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes. Is it indeed, laughed Gildor. Elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. But if you demand advice, I will for friendship's sake give it. I think you should now go at once without delay, and if Gandalf does not come before you set out, then I also advise this, do not go alone. Take such friends as are trusty and willing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ordway. Just as a reminder to those of you who are joining us, if you haven't had a chance to type in your question, you certainly still have time to do so, either in YouTube or on the Word on Fire Institute platform. So your lecture has generated a number of questions. Dr. Ordway, I think maybe to do a little bit of ground clearing off the top, could you perhaps offer a definition of allegory, or in what sense does Tolkien use the term allegory?
Well, that's a great question, and I love it because defining terms is so important for understanding what we're dealing with. In common usage, people often use allegory just to mean anything that represents something else, and that's kind of a casual usage. Mostly, it can work, but it's not what Tolkien means. He's using a literary definition of it. So, as an English professor, I can explain this. An allegory is a literary form in which there are two levels of the story that run through the entire story. There's the events of the narrative, that the characters do certain things, and then there's the meaning. And there's a mapping on that's consistent throughout the whole story. So all through it, everything the characters are doing translates into this other meaning. And the main point of reading an allegory is to see the connection as you go through. So the two elements interact with each other. The characters in the story bring to life the meaning, but the meaning also gives depth to what the characters are doing. So Pilgrim's Progress is a classic example, but as a more modern example, there's George Orwell's Animal Farm. Brilliant book. And Animal Farm is an allegory about, specifically about Stalinism, and more broadly about totalitarianism, about what happens when you have a totalitarian culture that takes over. Spoiler, doesn't end well. Now, you can read Animal Farm, as I did when I was about 10, as a story about horses and dogs and pigs who, have things going on. But that's kind of not the point. You're missing the point if you don't see that it's talking about totalitarianism. So that's an allegory, the literary form of an allegory. And that's the thing that The Lord of the Rings is not. So Tolkien is absolutely 100% accurate. The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory in that literary form. Does it have symbolic elements? Is Aragorn a Christ figure? Yes. But is it an allegory of the Gospels? Absolutely not. And I will also just toss out that the Chronicles of Narnia is also not an allegory. There are moments, for instance, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where, for instance, the death of Aslan is really a retelling of the crucifixion. But the books as a whole are not allegories of anything. They are their own stories. And just a little shout out to my friend and colleague Michael Ward, who, if you want to know more about this, Planet Narnia, that's the book you want to read. Really illuminate what Lewis is doing, and then also what Tolkien is doing. So that's, I think, an important distinction. I've elaborated on this a little bit because it's a really important ground clearing question. So to say that it's not an allegory is not to say that he's not using symbolism, imagery, themes. All these things could be working, but is there an overall structure that we just need to have the key, and then the key unlocks the meaning? No, that's not the kind of thing that it is. We have to know what sort of thing it is if we are going to appreciate it properly. So great question.
Excellent answer. I'm curious. Tolkien himself came into the Catholic Church while still a child. His mother was a convert to the Catholic Church. Could you speak a little bit to the Catholic sensibility, perhaps, behind this approach of writing The Lord of the Rings? In other words, was there something about his being a Catholic that had an impact on the final product, as it were?
That's a very interesting question and a complex one, because as we've just explored, The Lord of the Rings, its meaning comes out of everything that he is, who he is. So in a way, you would have to say, well, what would The Lord of the Rings have been like if he had remained an Anglican? What would The Lord of the Rings have been like if he had lost his faith in the Great War, as so many of his contemporaries did? So we should not take for granted that The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally religious and Catholic. There are many sort of counterfactual paths that we could take, but it is, because that's the book that he wrote, because that's the man he was. So it's really difficult to disentangle which aspects are specifically Catholic, which are broadly Christian, and which are coming from his desire, as he put it, to tell an exciting story. Tolkien once commented that only God and one's guardian angel can really know the sources of any particular aspect of a book. So we have to exercise some humility here. I think certainly the fact that he became a Catholic quite young, continued in the Catholic faith, the main thing I would point to, the Catholic sacramental attitude, I think, is one of the most deeply imbued aspects of it. The idea that material things can have spiritual meaning. So that's probably the thing I would point to as the most distinctively Catholic element of it. And you will note that I'm not pointing out specific images or things. That's maybe a more hazardous path to go down. Now, I know everyone in the chat is typing in, what about the lembas? Yeah, so I'm preempting. What about the lembas? Yes, the lembas clearly has Eucharistic resonances. And that makes absolute sense because Tolkien had a great devotion to the Eucharist and is submerged out of it. And again, I think this is one of the things that shows the nuances, because on the one hand, having food that they can carry with them that's lightweight and yet nourishing is, as he says somewhere, the only practical way narratively to get them to Mordor, right? Like that's the only way. So there's a plot function for Lembas. But also, in addition to that, the way he writes about it and the way he writes about its potency becoming more powerful when you rely on it, the way that Gollum can't eat it, that he chokes on it, these are Eucharistic resonances. Is it a symbol of the Eucharist? No, I would not say that. That would pin it down too much. Does it evoke the Eucharist? Yes. Did he intend for it to evoke the Eucharist? I think almost certainly yes. I think that's the case. So subtle.
Yeah. And I think maybe to give a little bit more background to the question, this book, The Lord of the Rings, has been a bridge for so many people, so many different types of people into the Catholic faith, into Christian faith, being open to that. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that, both from your own experience and why you think it does have that resonance with so many and provides a bridge for them.
Well, I think this is a really good question and a really good point. One of Tolkien's own readers wrote to him and said that he felt that he could perceive light as if from an invisible lamp suffusing the book. And many readers have felt that and been attracted to it. So I think part of it is that Tolkien is presenting a view of the world, a way of seeing the world that is fundamentally Catholic. He says as much. This has come out of who he is, what he believes. So we see things like, that good is a real thing, that evil is real and affects the good, and that it's right to, try to preserve the good and to fight against evil. This sort of sacramental understanding is an element that can come through. These are things that we can perceive, and we can perceive them, I think, with in a meaningful way because Tolkien believed them. And so we kind of, in a sense, have that encounter. And so that can be attractive for people to say, well, this is beautiful. I want to know more about this. I want to know more about this faith that is inspiring Tolkien and is illuminating his work. Why is this book different from, a book like, Game of Thrones? It has an exciting story, but not that same kind of quality of moral vision. What's going on here? And that can be very, very attractive. I am cautious about talking about this aspect of the Lord of the Rings because although it's definitely true that it is inviting and attractive and people want to know more about this vision, it's also absolutely correct to say that it is a profoundly moving and important book for many people who are not attracted to Christianity. And I think it's important to reckon with the fact that Tolkien is also tapping into, this is not an either or, he's tapping into really fundamental truths about human nature. You don't have to be a Christian to believe in the good, and that you should fight for it, that you friendship and love and all of these things. And he's tapping into real human experiences and needs. And that's very powerful. So I don't want to overstate it. I think it is absolutely true that it is an attractive and inviting opening for people who want to know more about the faith. But I'd also caution Christians who see this not to take a utilitarian point of view. This is not a gospel tract. He wrote a novel, and it's really important to recognize that it is legitimate to encounter it on your own terms. And it's legitimate to read it as I did, growing up, simply as the exciting story and as the profound and moving story without even noticing the religious elements. Because again, he deliberately kept them out as overt elements. This is something that he's deliberately creating. So we are still being true to his intention, I think, in allowing that space to have a non-religious but still powerful and moving encounter with the Lord of the Rings, because he's chosen to write from his own identity and self and what he believes, but also not putting it on the overt level of the text. And it's when we understand that it can be an invitation, but not being pushy, I think.
No, that makes sense. So we have a follow-up question about the use of hyperbole, strategic use of hyperbole. We have a member joining us from YouTube says, isn't hyperbole uncharacteristic for the English, who are said to prefer understatement as a national personality trait? So what say you?
Well, the English, like every other nation, are varied. And certainly understatement was a key feature of Tolkien's repertoire. But perhaps paradoxically, so was hyperbole. It was both of those things. And this is something that I discovered when I was doing the research for my first big Tolkien book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, trying to figure out what these apparent contradictions in what he's saying. And so Tolkien just had a flair of the dramatic. So this is a personality trait. So it's not a generally English trait. The English cultural trait is the understatement, the self-deprecation, especially the understatement about things that mattered to him. That's classically English, and it's absolutely what we have going on in Tolkien. In addition to that, there's the rhetorical device of hyperbole that was his personality. And it makes quite a curious mix, the fact that he will sometimes really downplay things and sometimes really exaggerate them. And the most interesting insight that I got from my research and from reading the observations of his friends is that the hyperbole was kind of the surface level. It was sort of dramatic, and he had sometimes fun with it, although he could also lose his temper. He sometimes went into hyperbole when he was annoyed and would lose his temper at things. But it tended to be hyperbole about less important things, or to try to make a point, like no allegory. He's making a point so that he can actually defend what he really cares about, the inner meaning, that he doesn't want to get trampled on. So he had a very complex personality. It's interesting to compare him to C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis, by comparison, had a very straightforward personality. And this is not, C.S. Lewis is a genius, tremendous, tremendous depths. But in terms of how he related with people, much more straightforward. Tolkien, in some ways, is a bundle of contradictions. He could lose his temper very quickly, but he was also apologize very quickly. He could exaggerate for effect, but then understate the things that he cared about most. And so this is one of the reasons why it's just so important not to take quotations in isolation. Some authors, it's pretty straightforward. Like C.S. Lewis, you can generally take a quote and it is what it says it is, but just public service announcement, make sure it's actually from Lewis. There's so many fake Lewis quotes running around, like just check first. Tolkien, not like that. It's really difficult to take a single quote and just have it stand, because when did he say that and in what context and why and how? Kind of nuance everything with Tolkien.
Could you say, perhaps, as you're talking about this kind of both and quality to Tolkien, to what degree might that be somewhat characteristic of Catholic thinking? So in Catholic thinking, we tend to not fall into either or as much. We tend to kind of focus on both and. So might that, in a sense, reflect his sensibility, or even the poetic sensibility? I'm just trying to understand, because it seems like it is very much a characteristic of him as a person.
Yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit on that. Not everything about Tolkien can be connected to his faith. I think that's sort of pushing it a little bit too far. I don't see that that's a reflection of the Catholic both and. I think it's a reflection of the fact that human beings are complicated. And that he just had different aspects of his personality. And the fact that he could be dramatic and use hyperbole on one hand, but also be self-deprecating and understating the other, I think that's just his personality.
Can you help us understand a little bit more about his upbringing, and what were some of the things that that he was exposed to, especially as a child? You mentioned a number of books, but what were some of his influences, you might say?
How much time do we have?
Yes. In 5 minutes or less.
Yes. Well, the really short version is read my books. Because I've done a major study of his modern reading. I'm looking at the things that he read growing up. So his literary influences are clearly a huge thing. Now, the book I referenced, Tolkien's Modern Reading, looks at his modern reading and shows that he really did read a lot more of contemporary literature than has often been recognized. So, for instance, he loved science fiction. Who knew, right? And read widely in contemporary literature. He also, this is a very important fact, he was deeply influenced, obviously, by his professional work. He was a medievalist, so medieval literature and the Germanic legends, sagas, all of that, huge influence. I mean, Smaug in The Hobbit is, in a sense, straight out of Beowulf. I mean, there's a lot of influence from that. He was a philologist, so his interest in languages was really deeply important to his work. He wrote all of his stories out of the impulse, like he invented these languages, as one does, and then wanted to think what kinds of stories would be told in these languages. So the languages came first, and then the stories came out of that, which is mind-boggling. But he created multiple Elvish languages and had them historically develop over time. It's mind-blowing. So that linguistic element, and then of course there is his life of faith, which is hugely important. I explore that in Tolkien's Faith. There's also his experience in the Great War. There's an excellent book by the Tolkien scholar John Garth called Tolkien and the Great War. Highly recommended. Looks at the way his Great War experience really shaped his creative writing. So there's experiential aspects, his coming to grips with suffering, with pain, with death. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in his life. So these are many different factors. So it's really important to kind of keep them kind of in awareness. We can zero in on one particular factor at one given moment, but we must always keep in mind none of these worked in isolation. I mean, also his personal life. Not only did he live in the fight in the Great War, but he was an orphan. His father died when he was 3. His mother died when he was 12. He was raised at the Birmingham Oratory. It was a very difficult time to be an English Catholic. It was very much a choice to hold on to his faith. It made his life much more difficult. He remained a Catholic because he believed it, not because it was just nostalgia or hanging on to his childhood faith. So all of these things are significant. And at any given point, one particular influence may be more significant than others. So if we ask, for instance, in The Hobbit, the character, the dragon Smaug, what is his source? Well, there's not just one source. There's all the dragons of literature. There's his own creative ideas. We can look at the Beowulf dragon as being particularly significant because there's a lot in that story that is a direct parallel. But Bilbo stealing the cup, for instance, and in that instance, it would be somewhat forced to try to have an interpretation that gave his faith as a source for that part of The Hobbit. It's not terribly relevant. That's not what that scene is about. The sources for that scene are primarily from his medieval language and literature grounding. However, there's a later chapter of The Hobbit called A Thief in the Night, in which Bilbo makes a very self-sacrificial move of taking the Arkenstone as his share of the treasure, and then giving it to the elves as a way to stop the upcoming war that's going to be so devastating, even though it means that he's cast out from the fellowship of the dwarves, and at that point does not think it's ever going to be reconciled. Now, that in narrative terms flows naturally from the characters and the events. But if you know that Tolkien was a Christian, he has given us a big signal with the title of that chapter. Thief in the Night is straight out of the Gospels, and Bilbo is acting as a Christ figure. Is it an allegory? I think we can all know now. No, it's not an allegory. Is there a resonance? Is there an imagery here? Does Bilbo have a role as a Christ figure during this part of the story? Yes. Is it necessary to see that to enjoy the story? No. If we do see it, does it enhance our appreciation of the richness of the text and its moral fiber? Yes. So that's kind of what's going on here.
Gotcha. So we have a number of authors and aspiring authors joining us today, and a number of questions circulating around just kind of understanding Tolkien's process of writing. I'm wondering if you could shed some light on that. Obviously, he is a philologist. He is deeply immersed in older literature as well as modern literature. What was his writing process like, and how might we learn from that?
That's such an interesting question, because I will start by saying that Tolkien is an absolute genius. And what he wrote works of genius, but he wrote so much more that he didn't finish. So in some ways, we have to say, perhaps his method is best admired but not imitated, unless you want to write millions of words and not publish them. Yeah, just saying. So looking at ways that we can emulate Tolkien, I think it's probably fair to say most of us are not going to first invent languages and then create stories to go with them. That's a distinctly sort of Tolkienian thing. Although if there's a budding linguist out there who wants to do that, more power to you. Most people are not going to do that. One thing I think we can take from him is that he allowed his sort of mythologies to develop over time. He didn't sort of sit down and just hash out a story and just knock it out and be done with it. That wasn't his mode. Now, you can take less time than he did. That's, but I still think being willing to spend time and sort of get into your world and understand it, that's a good thing for that kind of writing. One thing I think to note is that he just read a tremendous amount. He was incredibly literate man. I mean, multiple languages, and just read a ton. And that absolutely informs his work. I think that no good writer is not also a reader. In order to be a great writer, you must be a reader. I don't think there's any way around that. You must read. And read all sorts of things. I mean, Tolkien, as I show in Tolkien My Reading, he read all sorts of stuff. You don't have to limit yourself to, classics, but I think reading things that show you, how this is done. Tolkien knew his way around a sentence. Like he uses language with utmost precision. Every word that he uses, he absolutely chooses the right word. And that's something that in my teaching of writing, I'm really big on that. Is this the right word? Some of the people in the audience might be like, I've heard that in her teaching. So he really knows the language. He's not guessing at his word choice. He's not guessing at his allusions. There's lots of literary allusions. He's not guessing at it. It is coming out of his massive and deep reading. So read is something we can take from Tolkien. But I think one of the most important things, and this has inspired my own teaching, is that he wrote in community. He was a member of the group called the Inklings, which met for many years, centered around C.S. Lewis, but others, and they would meet every week in C.S. Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College, and they would read their works in progress, and they would offer commentary, feedback to each other. And also, he shared his work privately with friends and got their private feedback as well. Mm-hmm. And he says, and this is something we'll talk about more in tomorrow's lecture, he says that if it were not for Lewis, he would never have finished Lord of the Rings. Just straight up, he wouldn't have. And trust me, seeing how he worked, this is absolutely true. So we should be very grateful to Lewis. But the thing is that writing, it is an individual endeavor, and there's you and your text. but it doesn't have to be a solitary endeavor. And I think that it needs to be in community. And a book that has greatly inspired my own teaching and my own process is a book by Diana Glyer called The Company They Keep. And then on C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and friends in collaboration, and also her book Bandersnatch about how to apply that to writing. Because the Inklings encourage each other, they gave feedback, pushback, as well as encouragement and praise. And this really, really enriched all of their work. And that's something that I think writers need. You need to have other people who are reading your works. I do, as a writer. You need to have people who are willing to say, yeah, you lost me there. It can sting at first, but ultimately you want your work to be communicating with the reader, right? And that's what Lewis did for Tolkien. We'll talk about that again tomorrow, but that's something that I think we can really learn from the way that Tolkien related with his friends, that he really was writing in community. And that's why we have the Lord of the Rings.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have a question about the Lord of the Rings movies, trilogy of movies. And this member wants to know, what is your take on Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy? And did you enjoy the movies?
Yes, I did. The extended editions, I think we must note, the extended editions are the real versions. I like them very much. I think they are great films. Now, they're not perfect, but I think they're very, very good films. Now, does Peter Jackson understand all of Tolkien's characters as Tolkien presents them in The Lord of the Rings? No. When we get to Gondor, that's when things get a little dicey. He doesn't understand Faramir or Denethor. Those characters don't come across in the films the way that they're written in the books, I think to the detriment of the films. He just doesn't get them, and they don't work. Faramir is much more heroic and good in an authentic way in the book. And in the book, Denethor is much more of a tragic figure rather than the somewhat almost coarse figure that he is in the film. But there's so much in the film that is so good that I think he gets the vision of the books overall. Again, not perfect, especially with regard to character, but he really gets the vision of it. And of course, he makes some changes. He omits Tom Bombadil, and I think that was probably a wise decision, because that would be it's a great part of the book. But how to convey that without making it be weird or ludicrous? Tolkien shows his genius by managing to thread that needle with Tom Bombadil, but I don't think it would have worked in film. So, and I'm fine with film as a different medium. It's okay to have some different decisions. So I think they're really, really great films. However, the Hobbit movies, we will not speak of them. So we will just
Fair enough. There. So for those of our audience members who may not have read The Lord of the Rings yet, would you suggest that they dive right into The Lord of the Rings? Do they read some other works by J.R.R. Tolkien first? What would be your counsel for those folks?
First, I would say, great, yes, enjoy the books. And I think a lot of people now have come to the book through the films. And I say, great, if your first encounter is with the films, great, you've encountered his imaginative creation. Now there's more. I would recommend that if you haven't read any of them, I would start with The Hobbit, because he wrote The Hobbit first, and it's really important backstory. The first chapter of The Lord of the Rings is a long expected party. Well, why is it long expected? Like, wait, what? Well, it's a harkening back to the beginning of The Hobbit, which is an unexpected party. So you really will get more out of The Lord of the Rings if you've read The Hobbit first. And also The Hobbit is just a great book. Oh, it's just such a great book. It's also shorter. The Lord of the Rings is a big book. And by the Lord of the Rings is one book. It's not three. It's not a trilogy. It's one book. It was published in 3 volumes because that was the only way they could do it and still have it like an affordable price. And also Tolkien was still tinkering with the appendices up until the 11th hour, much to the maddening of his publisher. But it's one book, sometimes published in 3 volumes, which means if you have read The Fellowship of the Ring, you have only read a third of the book. It is not a complete, and Tolkien himself divided the story into 6 parts,
Right.
not 3. So it's one book, but it's hefty. So if you read The Hobbit first, it's shorter, a lot shorter, and it gets you into the world. And it gradually goes from a fairly light children's book. The tone darkens and deepens. It's really the perfect on-ramp for The Lord of the Rings. So I'd recommend The Hobbit. And then when you do get to The Lord of the Rings, I recommend that you skip the introductory material, like the preface, where like he talks about hobbits and things like that. Now, some of you might be saying, she's telling us to skip stuff that Tolkien wrote. Well, yes, I am. Some folks may enjoy getting into that first, but in my experience, a lot of people are kind of bewildered by it. Like, why are we learning about hobbits? Like, I want to find out what happens. And it just stops them from getting into the book. So just flip past that, get to chapter 1 and begin reading. And I advise you keep reading. The Fellowship, it starts off slowly and it gradually amps up the tension. So have some patience. It doesn't leap into the action. So keep going. Don't give up. There's lots about trees. It's okay. Just kind of go into it. And then you'll have a tremendously rewarding experience. Well worth it.
Well, to be continued. Thank you, Dr. Ordway. For those of you watching on the Word on Fire Institute platform, we will see you again tomorrow and Wednesday as we continue our conversation. For those of you joining on YouTube, I hope you'll go to institute.wordonfire.org to catch all the seminars we've already done. We'll join you back here in the studios tomorrow. Thank you, and God bless you.